Hello, I'm in Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, New York. I'm going to continue with Thelonious Monk, his life in music. One of the few people who hired Monk on a regular basis was the old master Coleman Hawkins. Monk would always be grateful to him for this. In his successful later years, it would be he who hired Hawkins. And when the saxophonist lay dying in 1969, Monk took the trouble to look after him. In 1944, Hawkins engaged Monk for his band. Alongside Don Byas on second tenor, trumpeter Benny Harris, and Denzel Best on drums. With Monk, but without Byas and Harris, he then entered the studio, producing the first official recordings of Thelonious Monk, Bean and the Boys. Monk was also on hand when the Hawkins band appeared at the Onyx Club. Hawkins' appreciation of Monk had its limits, however. Some of the most awful things that I ever had to endure, I endured on Monk's account. Hawkins would later report, "Every night I asked myself why I didn't get a normal pianist for the band." One critic at least recognized Monk's uniqueness, Herbie Nichols. As a pianist, he was as much a well-kept secret during his lifetime as Monk was in his early years. He also wrote about jazz, and in Music Dial, he praised the involved rhythmic structure of Monk's magnificent melodic lines. An increasing number of musicians, in fact, were now performing Monk compositions. But in accordance with the practice of the jazz community at the time, they would claim author or co-author rights. In any case, though he continued to help out in one or another band, Monk found little steady work or recognition as a pianist. His difficulties were compounded by the fact that he strictly refused to make compromises in his music or accept distasteful jobs solely for commercial reasons. And precisely because of its exotic character, bebop did have some commercial appeal. Intellectuals who identified themselves as the Beat Generation after the model of the Lost Generation looked upon it as protest music and helped make it fashionable. Now and again, Monk did manage to land a job. On February 21st, 1945, he got a welcome gig with Max Roach in Philadelphia. As the musicians were packing up their instruments after the show, the police stormed the club and went after Monk. He refused to show them his identification and was forcibly arrested. A fan barred the door and challenged the officer. They tried to push him aside, but he wouldn't budge. "Stop," he yelled. "You don't know what you're doing. You're mistreating the greatest pianist in the world." At this point, a nightstick came down on his head like a lightning bolt. The young fan was Monk's best friend, Bud Powell. He was dragged off along with Monk and thrown into jail after his injury was superficially treated at a hospital. After his release, Powell complained of alarming headaches. He eventually checked into Bellevue Hospital, then spent 3 months in Creedmoor Hospital. There, he was treated with various psychoactive drugs and shock therapy. His artistic career had barely started, but henceforth would be bedeviled by psychological problems. Monk was well aware that Powers' intervention had saved him from a similar fate. For his ill-starred protege, he wrote and walked Bud, 52nd Street theme and Broadway theme, otherwise known simply as the theme. These numbers were intended to be Bud's property alone, and Monk never recorded them. At the end of 1945, Monk participated in a musical event that made jazz history, though it did not boost his popularity much. The Coleman Hawkins Quartet, of which he was then a member, took part in the first of the great touring vehicles organized by Norman Granz. It had its premiere performance on November 26th at Philharmonic Hall in Los Angeles. This series evolved into the legendary musical event Jazz at the Philharmonic. but the number of Monk's dates was small in comparison with the success that certain of his former Menton's colleagues were enjoying. Among his friends, he had admitted that he was bitter that Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker got all the credit for the new music while he was overlooked. If they are going to claim this style for themselves and get all the success and recognition, I'll create another new style for myself and forge ahead with my own music. Thus Monk was heard to say, according to saxophonist Bud Johnson, who attended Monk's house seminars. I'm going to stop and take a little sip of this cold brew coffee with almond milk. This is the mocha. No, they're definitely not sponsoring me or paying me. I just like to give props where they're due. When I come across something that's great, I like to share it. I like to stop at this little health food, well, it's not that little, this health food place down the street on, I think it's 6th Avenue. It's between like 8th and 9th. It's called Lifetime. Anyways, super healthy stuff right here in Greenwich Village. Oh my God. This is like coffee and hot chocolate, but like more like upscale. Yeah. It's a very hot day out here in the park. And when you're in New York, you know, you kind of appreciate the warm days, because when it's cold here, boy, is it cold. Monk would interest young musicians in his compositions simply by playing them patiently and deliberately. His mother would meanwhile see to it that the guests got something to eat and drink. The result was that Monk got the chance to perform his music with its distinctive themes in an intimate ensemble setting. Sonny Rollins belonged to this private circle, and the young Miles Davis, while visiting New York in 1945, likewise frequented Monk's home. Years later, he stated that his progress would not have been as fast without his exposure to Monk. Yet, before Monk finally got the chance to make his own recordings as a band leader, a stint with Dizzy Gillespie's big band helped him to get recognized as a composer. Early in 1946, Gillespie undertook to translate bebop into a big band setting. He hired Gil Fuller as the arranger. Fuller and Gillespie were greatly interested in Monk's originals. After tryouts with Monk's protege, Bud Powell found her due to his psychological problems. Monk became the pianist in the orchestra. If you're wondering why I'm reading in full, loud voice, it's because, well, there's a lot of noise out here in this park today. So if I do the whispering ASMR thing, you know, you probably wouldn't hear me too well. So, but rest assured, when I'm home, I will definitely continue to read in ASMR, relaxed, whispering, soft voice. What is less well known is that Monk also took charge of arranging his own compositions. He found arranging for a big band to be tedious work, although later he would take some pleasure in preparing arrangements for smaller groups. Kenny Clarke became Gillespie's drummer after his term of military duty in Europe was over. While in the Army and serving at Normandy, Clarke had gotten to know the pianist and arranger John Lewis. He recommended him now to Gillespie, who hired him as arranger of the compositions not written by Monk. Monk's attitude to work was more professional than Bud Powell's, but he was unpunctual on principle, and Gillespie grew more and more tired with him. When Monk, this time with Kenny Clarke, arrived late for an appearance, once again the orchestra had already begun to play. John Lewis was substituting on piano, and vibraphonist Milt Jackson had taken over the drums. Fortunately for Clarke, Gillespie was only waiting for his arrival to unobtrusively relieve Jackson of the drumming duties. Monk was less fortunate. He was fired on the spot. John Lewis got Monk's job, much to Gil Fuller's chagrin. This incident marked, if not the birth, then the moment of conception of one of the most successful units in modern jazz. Milt Jackson, John Lewis, Kenny Clarke, and bassist Ray Brown were the founding members of the modern jazz quartet. The fact that Monk was replaced by John Lewis negated a beautiful, if speculative, dream, that of a quite different modern jazz quartet, one whose outlines can be discerned in the occasional collaboration of Monk with Milt Jackson and Kenny Clarke. The Blue Note years, bright prospects. At the beginning of 1947, Dizzy Gillespie, Monk's exact contemporary, was a celebrated star on trumpet. Charlie Parker, 3 years Monk's junior, was the hero of a growing cult of genius. Both Parker and Gillespie could already look back on an impressive body of recordings. Monk, it is true, was known among insiders as a composer. Owing to the performances and appearances of Gillespie's bands and Parker's combos, both of which had several Monk numbers in their repertoire. But with the exception of the 1944 recordings with Coleman Hawkins, which were hard to get hold of, his playing was not officially represented on record. Now at the end of his 20s, Thelonious Monk's opportunity seemed to have arrived. The independent record company Blue Note decided to sign him. The firm had been founded in 1939 by Alfred Lyon, an immigrant from Berlin. His friend, Frank Wolf, also a refugee from Nazi Germany, joined on the same year. Their program favored modern swing combos especially. In 1945 and 46, they had considerable success with the Ike Quebec Swing-Tet. But Quebec was friendly with the modern pianists Bud Powell, Tad Dameron, and Thelonious Monk. In Monk especially, Quebec had an unshakable faith, and he succeeded in getting Wolf and Lyon to share it. With the enthusiasm born of a new beginning, and enthusiasm also shared by Lyon's wife Lorraine, they undertook to promote Monk. They sold him as the high priest of bebop, the mysterious and legendary figure who was responsible for the entire new trend in music, the genius behind the entire movement. Monk was personally opposed to this crass advertising campaign. He modestly insisted that he had only played at Menton's, he hadn't given lessons. Nevertheless, his name now began to appear in the trade press with some frequency. William Gottlieb, Ira Peck, George Simon, and Orrin Keepnews all wrote features about him. The bright prospects that opened before Monk led to an important change in his life. Always the shy mumbler, who knew only his private way of life, he now had the confidence to ask a young woman from the neighborhood named Nellie Smith to marry him. An unspoken mutual affection had existed between them from their playground days. Nellie made sacrifices for Monk, whom she idolized. She would light his cigarettes and silently hand them to him when he was lost in his thoughts. She took care to bring order into his apartment, doing his laundry and washing his dishes. It was Nellie's unconditional willingness to take charge of Monk's domestic affairs and become a second mother to him that induced Monk to regard marriage with her as natural and attractive. Monk's home was still on West 63rd Street in San Juan Hill, as it had been since childhood. The region was now deteriorating, owing in part to their proximity to the docks, which were in a long decline. The apartment was dominated by a combination living room kitchen with a very lived-in look. The centerpiece of the room was the Steinway Grand that Monk leased. Over the piano hung a photo of Dizzy Gillespie with his personal dedication. On the ceiling, there was a photo of Billie Holiday. Sources report that the piano was often covered with dirty dishes. Francis Hodges, in his book La Danse des Infidèles, recounts a surprise visit he and Bud Powell paid on Monk. Monk greeted them at the door with the cryptic invitation, "Come in. I'm going to make the plane for you." He led them into the main room and sat himself at the piano. at that time supporting about a week's worth of dishes. He then depressed both pedals and played a chord with all 10 fingers. The sonic vibration set the plates to rattling, and according to Podgers, produced a sound exactly resembling that of a squadron of fighter planes roaring overhead. The combination kitchen and living room led into 2 other rooms, one of which was Monk's hideaway. This refuge was the privilege granted Monk by his mother, since the apartment, besides his wife and mother, was shared by Monk's sister, Marion, her husband, and a nephew. The family ties were strong, and Monk's brother Thomas also lived in the neighborhood. Thelonious and Nellie's bedroom had only one small window that looked out on a courtyard in the rear. In this setting, Monk spent most of his time during the following years. Widespread success would not come with the Blue Note records. They sold only in Harlem and the neighborhoods of northern Manhattan. Still, Lorraine Lyon did what she could to make Monk better known downtown as well. She persuaded Max Gordon, owner of the legendary club, the Village Vanguard, to engage Monk. But this guest appearance was a financial disaster. The intellectuals in Greenwich Village sneered at what they considered Monk's primitive technique. The limited sales of Monk's early records may be partly due to the fact that Blue Note, a progressive company in other respects, was still clinging to the 78 RPM format, whereas larger companies had already made the transition to 33 1/3 RPM. Another reason may be that Monk's records were simply ahead of their time. In any case, they did not conform to the expectations created by advertising Monk as the father of bebop. With his preference for moderate and slow tempos and his insistence on the carefully crafted composition, Monk was never a typical bebopper. Considered on their own terms, the Blue Note records are difficult to fault, being among the best of Monk's career. Fresh and hungry for recognition, he was finally able to commit to the medium of records his own new music without compromise, and with a group of musicians trained by him personally. His efforts, however, went largely unnoticed. In the annual Readers' Poll of 1948, conducted by the jazz journal Downbeat, Monk received a grand total of 23 votes for Best Jazz Pianist. At the beginning of the same year, he had a prolonged guest spot at Minton's with the musicians who were already on Blue Note. He also played a concert at New York's famous Town Hall. But the opportunities he had to appear in his native city were becoming fewer and fewer. In August, he was found in possession of marijuana and spent 30 days in jail. He also lost his cabaret card for a year. Without it, he could not appear in clubs where alcohol was served. In March of 1949, Monk reluctantly performed outside New York City and Chicago's Hotel Pershing, and with no great success. On August 31st of that year, he was on hand for the opening of the legendary jazz club Birdland. Typically, he ignored the nervous request of the owner, Oscar Goodstein, to please not put his glass on top of the brand new piano and not rest his burning cigarette on the keys. Monk made fun of these admonitions, which shows how difficult he could be, but also shows, incidentally, how he conceived of the piano as a workspace, an instrument in the true sense to be subjected to his will and needs, and no one had better cross him in the process. During another gig, he suddenly disappeared on the piano and tore at the pedal bracket because the rods connected to the pedals were not working properly. None of these things were calculated to make managers enthusiastic about hiring him. The Readers' Poll in Downbeat that year reflects his commercial nadir in no uncertain terms. He did not get a single vote. Monk's popularity, if one can speak of such a thing, did not decline in isolation. The music with which he was generally identified was headed the same way. For the young members of the straight-laced middle class, cool jazz or West Coast jazz regarded by many as a white version of bebop or the New Orleans revival, were the genres of music they now identified with. Genuine bebop became increasingly marginalized. As art music, it did not command a large following even in the African American community, where youth identified with rhythm and blues coming from such labels as Motown, founded in Detroit in 1949. Outwardly, Monk did not allow himself to appear embittered. He holed up in his apartment, playing the piano for even longer stretches of time, or just listened to records. His wife tried to shield him from all unpleasantness, and with various domestic jobs, she contrived to keep the household together. Thanks for listening. May we meet in the next video, and may you find lasting happiness. Goodbye for now.